everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Corona Spotlight. Today, my guest will be Tammi. Sorry, I should probably show you me. Yeah, there I am. Um, my guest today will be Tammi Moses, hoarding interventionist and founder of the Hoarding Solution podcast, that is fresh out here on the interwebs. And today, Tammi is going to show us or talk to us a little bit about the impact that hoarding can have on your peace of mind, and especially when you're locked at home during this coronavirus quarantine. So, without further ado, Tammi, how you doing today? Welcome.
I'm doing all right, Gail. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to talking with you and helping people understand a little more about things.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Now, for some of our listeners out there, it might seem a bit of a stretch to say, like a hoarding interventionist is going to help us through this coronavirus quarantine. But like we were just talking about before the show began, especially if you're locked in with someone else's hoarding problem, it can be very anxiety inducing, correct?
Yes, very much so, especially if you are a person who finds that clutter to be anxiety producing for you. And if you normally are able to get out and go to school or go to work or volunteer or whatever you normally do, that's a way for you to escape that for a period of time. And now you might be stuck in that situation and not able to get out for a period of time, which can be very frustrating if you're living in that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So tell us a little bit. Well, actually, let me kind of piggyback on that, because sometimes, in my experience, I have two daughters, very much different from each other. The older one has always been papers everywhere. She's different now as an adult, but as a kid, she was not one that kept her room clean. And my younger daughter used to have a lot of anger issues, like a lot of I wouldn't necessarily have called it anxiety. In fact, one of my friends called her a little tyrant at the time, when she was going through all this. And then my older daughter got to be about 12 years old, and we built her a separate bedroom that she could have for herself. And that very morning, my younger daughter cleaned up the room that they had shared together. It never got dirty again, and she was a delight to deal with after that. Okay, so I mean, I can see from that there are certain people that really have to have ordered surroundings, and there's certain people that are fine with clutter, and then there's even further on the spectrum where the hoarding comes in. Can you tell us a little bit more about that I guess that spectrum, and where people might end up on it and why?
So, and you're right, there is a huge spectrum that people can fall on, from that pristine home, which looks like no one lives in it, all the way up to, I mean, you might have that middle of the road clutter all the way up to, we need a dumpster to solve this problem. And first, I'll talk a little bit about like the situation with your daughters, where your one daughter was like, whatever, I can deal with the clutter, the paper doesn't bother me. And the other daughter's like, holy cow, like this is like so stressful for me. And I can see where that stress or that anxiety would come out as anger, because perhaps she felt like she couldn't control her environment. And so that made her angry. And once she was able to control some piece of her environment, she was able to say, okay, now I have a space I can control, and I'm not angry anymore because now I'm in charge of this. Mm-hmm. And so I see that same situation. If you're a person that can handle clutter, doesn't really bother you if there's dishes in the sink, versus someone who's like, there could be no dishes ever, like overnight, like that's not going to happen. I would say a lot of us kind of are in the middle as people, what we can tolerate and what we can't. And what I see in the hoarding spectrum, like if you're full blown hoarding, I see a lot of unaddressed trauma. I see grief. I see people who have survived some kind of traumatic event. Hoarding, that tendency could be dormant for many years, and something could happen that tips them into that coping mechanism, like death or divorce or loss of a pet or a job. And so sometimes it's dormant, it's not happening, but then something trips that trigger that causes someone to fall into that. And so
that kind of leads me to the question: what is it that I mean, you just touched on it a second ago, like, but what is it that's really behind hoarding? Yeah,
well,
at the source of it.
So I was thinking about the difference. Like, I would say, like, right now, in some instances, we're dealing with like situational hoarding, where we are able to leave our house. We're supposed to be, secured, and so we want to make sure we have enough stuff to get through this particular period. Versus someone who's been hoarding for 20 years and you can't walk in the door, or their fridge is so full of old food, there's no way to put fresh food in it. And so what I see is like a difference in the mindset around why someone would be hoarding. And what I see is like there's this void in a lot of people that hoard, and the way they fill it is with stuff. And often what they don't recognize is that the more stuff you bring in, the more you push other people away, the more you're isolating, the more you are disconnecting from people who you might otherwise want to connect with.
So, in other words, that void never gets filled because it's meant to be filled by connection.
Right. That's what I am seeing. And what I have seen is that if you start working with someone who is like ready, not everyone's ready to clear their space. That's a whole different scenario. But if they allow you in and you start working with them, the one thing they want to do is tell you the story behind the objects, behind the things they have. And oftentimes that story is about pain and loss and disconnection. And so some people shop to fill that void. Some people gather free stuff to fill that void. And so if you start pulling back on it, or you start, ripping this is kind of gross, but kind of how I look at it, where if you haven't dealt with some of the trauma and the things that are causing you to hoard, and then someone comes in and just starts ripping it away, it's like peeling back a scab that's not been healed. And so
that's an apt description, because it is a wound, isn't it?
Yes, it is a wound. It really is. And when I see, you can't always tell from the exterior of a home that there's a problem, but sometimes you can. And when I drive past a house like that, I think about how many people are living there that are suffering in this situation. And it's trauma and anguish and pain and anger. And that's what I see when I see this stuff. I'm not saying that the stuff isn't the problem or a problem, but it's a manifestation of other things that are going on that haven't been dealt with.
Yeah, it's a symptom as opposed to the problem itself. Got it. So essentially, you're also saying that the people that now have 200 packages of toilet paper in their basement are a different mindset than somebody who's got 20 years of Popular Mechanics magazines in their basement.
In their basement, or in their shower, or if their their kitchen counters and surfaces are completely covered with old papers and bottles and dishes and takeout containers, that's a different situation to me than someone who said, hey, I want to make sure I have enough toilet paper. So, I bought, 50 rolls or whatever. And they likely have somewhere to store that, first of all, appropriately. They aren't going to
Mm-hmm.
just bring it and dump it on a pile. But also they're going to use it up over a
Mm-hmm.
period of time.
Yeah, gotcha.
And the rest of their space is most likely useful. They're able to sleep in their bed. They're able to sit in their living room. They're able to still navigate their space versus someone who has so much stuff already that you're basically on goat paths. That's how you're navigating through the
Gotcha.
space.
Gotcha. Um, Now, personal aside here. My stepfather was a hoarder. That's where I came with the Popular
Mm.
Mechanics and the Consumers Reports and the National
National
Geographics,
Geographic.
and all of these other magazines that had these. He hoarded information.
Mm.
Anything that had information that he wanted to be able to access again someday. And those National Geographics were going to be worth big money if they had been properly stored and didn't get mold all over them.
Right.
But there's a sense that I picked up from his attitudes about it, that there's a sense of control that is satisfied for somebody who's a hoarder by knowing that they may never actually reach out and use that thing again. But knowing that they could, that it's always going to be there. Is that something that you find across the board, or is that just my stepdad's particular flavor of what made him hoard?
Well, I would say that control is a huge piece of hoarding.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like the idea that they could access that information at any time, it means they've already acquired it. It's in their space. They don't have to ask permission. They don't have to ask somebody else to get them that information. That idea that it's readily accessible in their space. And a lot of people are like, well, it's my money. I can buy what I want. I can do what I want. And so who are you to tell me what I can and can't do?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say specifically that I have seen that with most people that have a severe hoarding issue. It is about control.
Mm-hmm.
It is about their space and this idea that no one else can really intervene.
Gotcha.
And so it can be part of the challenge where, like, you may have seen like that your stepdad had a big problem and you may have tried to talk about it, bring it up, say, hey, I'm worried about you, or however, we don't always bring it up in the best way. I know, because I did it myself with my own parents, where it's like, okay, well, this is a problem and everybody's bugging me, telling me I have to fix it. But yet you refuse all help. So what do I do? How do you navigate that when you can see that there's a problem and they can't?
Right.
And so it is a challenge for anyone who is seeing a problem and trying to say something. It's really difficult to get someone to listen who doesn't think they have a problem.
Right. And I imagine the people who connect with you for help are not even necessarily the ones that actually have the hoarding problem, because they don't see it like a problem. This is the way
Right.
that they want their life. They want all their things around them where they can reach out and touch them if they need to. So
And
who is
it's
it
a
that
comfort for
yeah?
them.
So who is it that reaches out to you and connects with you for help? What person
So
should I should say?
I've had people who are concerned about a family member, a neighbor, a friend. In general, they are the people that initiate a conversation with me. And a lot of times what I first focus on when I talk with them is, how are they doing? How is your self-care? What's your mindset? Where are you at in this situation? Because you can care a whole lot and still have a person who won't allow anything to happen until there is a crisis. And so a lot of times it's a matter of helping them figure out where are they at, what can they actually personally afford, like mentally afford to do in that situation. However, I have also had people who have an issue who have decided they are done for whatever reason and say that I have to move, or my spouse is going to divorce me, or something external is happening that's forcing that action. And then I have helped those people with on-site work, sort and pack and do whatever we need to do. And so I've had a mix of both. And I also have clients now, given our status, where they're like, hey, I have this pile of stuff and I don't know where to start. So can we have a conversation? And so I'll do a consultation. I'll be like, show me your space, show me what's going on, tell me what's going on from your perspective, and then tell me what you're already doing that works, habit stacking, and where can we take some things that you want to do and put that on there. If you're making your coffee in the morning and you have your pile of mail from the last week, maybe what you could do while you're standing there waiting for that to brew is just sort through some of that. Separate it. This is a bill, this is junk mail. And so that way, at least you're doing something already. You're building on something you're already doing. And so I'm actually really happy to help anyone dealing with a clutter challenge, because no matter where you are on that spectrum, usually there's a point where you're like, I don't know, emotionally, I can't do this room because it's where the military flag is. It's where the baby shoes are. And so I've had people who've done like their whole house, they're getting ready to sell or prepping for photos or whatever, and they've done everything except there's that one room. And so it's nice to be able to say, hey, here's this room or here's this section, and I don't really know what to do here. And so we can just kind of talk through that. And then I just create a little plan. Hey, here's what we talked about. Here's some ways that you can start dealing with it, And for anyone doing anything, sometimes it takes a while for clutter to build up. It takes a while for it to get to be a crisis point or a point that you can't tolerate it anymore. And so give yourself a little grace that as you start to go through it, it's also going to take you a little bit of time to go through that. And if you stare at the entire room, you're going to be overwhelmed. But if you say, I'd like to use that basket somewhere else. Let's pull that basket out. Let's take it to another room. Let's sort through it. And then voila, now you've sorted it into what you're keeping, what you're burning or shredding, and what needs to get donated or whatever. You find that you can focus on that one section much easier than if you're just sitting in the middle of a room, waiting for all the things to just on you.
Yeah.
Avalanche risk is real, I'm saying.
Yeah, God, that's kind of a scary idea. Scary thought. So, I can't imagine that somebody came into your third grade classroom on career day and said, hey, I help people clean up their houses. So how did you fall into this line of work?
Well, falling is a good word. It was not my original intention to publicly talk about hoarding. In fact, I grew up in that environment to a degree. It wasn't as severe as some of the things we see on TV and things. At that point, it was not. I was one of those kids that thought if I polished the curio cabinet that would make things better in the living room. And okay, the glass was shiny, but it didn't do anything about the boxes and the thing, and so I had made the decision as a teenager that if I ever got out, I would never come back. I would never come back to this environment. And my senior year of high school, I had that opportunity to move out and live with an older lady who I'd known. She was kind of like a surrogate grandma for me. And she had health issues, and her kids needed someone to live with her. So I was like, woo, running water, my own room, my own bathroom, use of your car. It's on the school bus line. I'm out of here. And um, anyway, that was kind of my experience of escaping. And I told myself I'd never go back. And about 3 months into that situation, I was a cocky 18-year-old. I knew what I was doing, right? I wasn't going to listen to anyone. And so that situation kind of fell apart. And then I ended up moving in with my grandma, who at first was like, I don't want to make your dad mad. I was like, well, I'll start calling other people if you aren't going to say yes, because I'm not going back. And so that's kind of how I ended up enlisting in the military. And I just did everything I could to get away, not realizing that your stuff comes with you, that mental baggage, that emotional stuff, you take it with you. It doesn't matter where you go. And so I was in the military. I was married for 15 years. Thankfully, I chose to end that because it was necessary. And then I kind of stumbled around into business and started talking about housing issues and my concerns in my area, lack of housing, lack of affordable housing. And eventually it became pretty apparent that I knew about hoarding. And I had a discussion with a business mentor who was like, so, that's like a thing, right? Like there's shows and you might want to explore that more. So that's kind of how that evolved into, I do know about this. Everywhere I go, if I talk about what I'm saying, people will tell me a story, their parent, their sibling, their grandma, a parent, a friend that they had from work and they had no idea until they went to their house. And so it kind of started to snowball once I realized this isn't my story alone. This really isn't about me. And it was it's a light bulb that kind of took a while to turn on, but I realized so many people had experienced it, but weren't willing to put their name out there. They're not willing to tell their story publicly. And I get it. I totally get it because I didn't for years. But then I started to realize how much our stories need to be told, how much it's impacting family members. It's disconnecting people in their relationships. It impacts firefighters if they're trying to access
yes.
a building. If it's heavy content. So if it's a heavy content home, the fire path changes. And so that can cause lots of issues. If your emergency personnel need to get a stretcher in there, you need 36-inch path. That can be hard to come by in a hoarded home. Yeah. And so someone will go in for surgery, right? And they're going to go home. And then all of a sudden you discover they can't go home because they can't navigate a walker through their space. So there's this hidden piece of it that just isn't being addressed appropriately, in my opinion. And
like they say, our secrets keep us sick. Yeah, you can't actually address any issue until you acknowledge that there's an issue to address.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Now, I want to kind of dig a little bit, if you will allow me. What was your experience as a kid living inside of all that hoarding? I mean, my experience is a little different because I didn't hit it until I was a teenager when my stepfather moved in, and most of his stuff, the basement was his domain, and that's where the hoarding happened. But my mom had depth perception issues, and she was just not willing to tolerate any clutter on the living room area, the main floor, because she would trip over it and hurt herself. But down in the basement, you could barely get through. We had 6-foot tall stacks of mahogany dowels that someday he was going to do something with, right down there. So what was it like as a little kid growing up in just an environment where that's just the way that it was? And then how did you get to going, there's something wrong?
So my path is a little strange because for the first 7 years of my life, we lived in town. We had TV, running water, a younger brother. Um, and the truth is I don't really remember. I've seen pictures recently, but I didn't really remember it being cluttery. There was like stacked like boxes, but not like trip hazards or falling over or anything like that. Um, when I was 7, we moved to a one-room cabin. So 4 of us moved to one-room cabin, and a lot of stuff from the house went into storage units. So for like 4 years, we had this time period where there wasn't room for clutter. There was no way that you could have extra stuff. Mm-hmm. And at that point, my dad was building a bigger house. And then when I was 11, we moved into this bigger house. Well, at that point, the stuff from the storage had to migrate somewhere. And then we had boards because the house wasn't finished yet. And so there was stuff, but you could still like use the living room and the kitchen and the things. You could still do things. But it was like excessive stuff. And if I had friends and I went to their house, they didn't live that way. So I knew what we were doing was weird. Mm-hmm. I just, in the back of my head. And eventually it got to the point where I was like, I'm not inviting my friends over anymore. I'm not going to have a slumber party, even though my mom says I can. The last time I remember, I was probably about 13, and I had an upstairs room, and I wouldn't allow anyone to put anything in my room. They're like, no, none of your stuff can come in here. I don't care if it's a toy, camping gear, nothing. Anyway, I had a friend's mom come and pick her up. And when she came in the house, there was this huge stack of egg cartons. Not eggs in them, but just cartons. And she was dressed very nice, mm-hmm. Scarf, slacks, and she happened to tap that stack and it all just tumbled over. And I remember thinking, I will never invite friends over again, ever. Yeah. And so it was very shaming, and it was very isolating. Mm-hmm. Although I did have neighbor friends and I had cousins, and people did come over that kind of didn't expect me to fix it, mm-hmm. versus people who did think I should do something at 12. I'm like, well, my experience is if I move something, that causes trauma and drama, and I don't like that. So therefore, I don't try to fix it anymore. I just retreat to my clutter-free room.
I gotta say how much I identify with you with that. You and I had talked before about when my mother passed away and we were gathering photographs for her funeral. The anxiety that I saw just overcome my stepdad, just with the idea of us taking pictures of my mother and my grandfather out of the house, right? And then once the funeral was over, I mean, we had a full family argument because he was accusing my sister-in-law of stealing the photographs and not returning them. And it wasn't her. I took the picture of my mother with me. And I had to call him and go, no, don't be mad at her. It's me. But the snapshot of the anxiety that it rose up in him to have anything removed from the house. Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, now that you're mentioning it, I was thinking about.
Yeah.
My younger brother had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Okay. And so he had a lot of extra care needs, as he got older. And something I can now I think back on it and I think, wow, I thought my life was weird. How much stranger was his, being in a wheelchair, being in a hoarded home, being, even more stigma. Like, there's this idea that if your body doesn't work, neither does your brain or your ears. Mm-hmm. And so he had this, he's like, well, I'm not deaf. I can totally hear what you're saying to me. which I always think is kind of an interesting thing because I see it now. But um, it, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. Can you say your question again?
You know, just the anxiety that it brings up
Oh,
for
the
people.
anxiety piece.
Yeah. When you
Um,
try to take something out of the house for whatever reason.
so I was like, okay, well, I had to talk about my brother, but that
Hmm.
was part of that was he had to have a back surgery when he was 15. So
Hmm.
I would have been about 17. But he was going to come home and be like in a back brace and have real limited, even more limited mobility. And he was going to need like home care aides to come in. And so while my brother was having that surgery done, my dad and people that he knew were at home cleaning out the house. And so I had been with my mom and my brother for that week in Seattle. And then I came home. So I was there for week 2 of
Hmm.
this clean out. And at that point, there wasn't much for me to do but like label things and things like that. So I wasn't really involved with like the hauling and the burning and all that. But when my mom and brother came home a week later, um, it was so traumatic for her that there were like 3 days of nonstop crying and tears, and people stole my stuff, people burned my stuff. I'm not going to say that maybe she didn't have a right to be upset, but I can still see her face. I can still hear that happening. And so I kind of made this vow to myself that I wouldn't ever treat someone that way. Like I wouldn't ever want their anxiety to be that high.
Hmm.
And so but I do feel it's helped me pull into what's really going on with people instead of charging in like a bull and saying, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
Even though that might be what needs to happen, you can still do it in a way that they still feel respected as a person,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
valued.
Yeah. Um, the point of what I was talking about with my stepfather was because of that trauma and anxiety that it
Mm-hmm.
caused him. My siblings and I all decided to leave our mother's stuff alone until he passed,
Mm-hmm.
and then we would deal with his sister about getting the things, the heirlooms and antiques and things
Mm-hmm.
that should come down to us through our mother. So we just went hands off on it. You know, we did because of exactly that. We were afraid that he was going to end up in a situation or an emotional
Mm-hmm.
vortex like your mom ended up. And like
Mm-hmm.
you said, to a certain extent, rightfully so. I mean, if somebody came in while you were away and took your furniture and burned it on your front lawn, you'd be just as upset as she was, regardless of whether the furniture is the appropriate thing to have in your house or not the appropriate thing to have in your house.
Right.
You know, so yeah, that was the choice that we made to just go. I'm not gonna deal with it. And I'm gonna deal with your sister because she's much more reasonable and doesn't have this attachment issue. But not everybody has that privilege to wait. So when you go in and you work with a hoard, you know, say for instance, a family member says, you know what, we need your help to deal with this woman or this man or whoever the hoarder happens to be. How do you manage the process of guiding them to choose to release items? I'll put it that way.
So the first part of it is, well, I have a situation where, well, I have two actually. One where the family was encouraging the person with the issue to call me, to connect with me. Um, I had met that person a couple different times, inadvertently. It wasn't like a planned thing. It just it happened, and it took about a year. But finally, that person did call me and say, you know, my family's worried about me. Can you come to my house and we'll do a walkthrough? And It needed help. There's no doubt about that. And so we came up with a plan, and she agreed to let me come in and help her do it. And in her case, it was more about physical mobility than anything else. Like, there wasn't the ability to lean over and pick something up anymore. And so things would fall and stay there. And so she would tell me, this is what I did, or this is why I have this thing. And we just kind of would have piles and sort through it. But her thing was just kind of telling me what was going on, and she was able to release that. We set it out in the garage. She had someone come haul it away. And so, but one of the points I want to make about that is she actually let me in. And a lot of times that's the hardest part, is getting them to say, yes, I have an issue, please come in. And if you go into that situation, know that it's going to be clutter that you usually don't expect. There might be odors that you're not anticipating. A scarf with some lavender oil is right there.
Good tip.
Just things where you don't walk in with a mask, but you can be like aware that you might need it. Be
a posy of flowers. Yeah.
Yes. And the other part is, I had another situation where a housing advocate contacted me, and we made arrangements to do the walkthrough. We did that. We talked with the person. They were present. They were on board with everything. We're saying, hey, this eviction is going to happen pretty soon. If we don't deal with this, here's how we can go about it. And they basically refused all help. And those are the hard ones for me, because they obviously haven't dealt with underlying issues. They don't see that the clutter is a problem. They don't understand why they were failing inspections. And even though you do everything you can, it's still their stuff, it's still their space, and they might refuse help.
Gotcha.
And in that particular scenario, someone is still going to be tasked with removing the stuff. It would just be preferable if the person who owns it could move it or take it or make the decisions.
Yeah.
And so often it's that outside force that causes a shift. And if that person hasn't dealt with their underlying things and they move to a new spot, the hoarding is probably still going to be an issue. They might, and that's the thing with forced cleanouts as well. If you come in and just force it, they can get it back to that state within 6 months, just because now they're re-traumatized.
Yeah.
Because someone forced that.
Yeah.
So it really can be situationally dependent, but I will say that, if you have a parent that is needing to go home and they can't because of the stuff, that's a time to say, look, Mom, I'm concerned about this XYZ, and in order for you to go home, we have to do this, and we'll be very careful about keeping your heirlooms or your jewelry, or people have lived in a home for 40, 50, 60 years sometimes, and
possessions accumulate.
It accumulates, and even if it's not full scale, they still might have a need for things to be pushed back, create the path. There's something called safety day. So you don't necessarily clean out the entire space. You just make it safe for them to navigate.
Gotcha.
And sometimes you can get someone to buy into that piece of it a little easier than if you are telling them you're going to clean up the whole space. I wouldn't recommend that if you're dealing with rodents or animals that are not, if they're going to the bathroom everywhere in the house, that type of thing. It's going to be a little harder to accommodate that. But sometimes you can clear out a house and you don't know how much damage has been done until you've cleared it away, and you might have to replace flooring or ceilings or things like that.
Yeah.
So
Gotcha.
I would say don't overpromise. Be real conservative of your expectations of what someone's willing to allow you to do to make their space safer.
Gotcha. Now, I want to talk to people a little bit about how to get in touch with you. So definitely follow Tammi on the Hoarding Solution at the Hoarding Solution on Instagram and YouTube, and you can also go to her website at www.homesforliving.com. And watch out for these hashtags that Tammi uses. One is hashtag YLITH, and the other one is hashtag AKOPTH. Now, they don't spell out anything, so I want to know, what are they?
So I started talking about youth living in the hoard, which is what the YLITH came from, because there are kids, there's minor kids, there's young adults, there's people in college, and all those people are often living in a hoarded situation. And I realized that there were certain tools that I used as a youth that helped me navigate and survive. And I didn't recognize that at the time, but now I'm like, oh yeah, I was in swimming class so I could use the shower. I did laundry at my grandma's. So there's things like that where you can find kind of your survival skills if you're in that situation. And the other one, the AKO PTH, I kind of came up with adult kids, parents that hoard, because there's a lot of us. My parents had that situation. My dad has passed away. My mom is there. They both hoarded different things. And so now I'm navigating that with my own parent. And she listens to my boyfriend more than she listens to me. That's a clue. If you might need someone in your corner that's not you. But I decided that there's so many of us that have this, whether you disclose it or not, that are dealing with aging parents. And aging parents is one thing, but if you have aging hoarding parents, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And so there's one other one, and it's not mine. It's adult children of hoarders, ACOH. And I decided that I'm an adult. I don't want to be referred to as the adult child. And for me, kid kind of has that dual purpose, because as a kid, we had goats. And so I kind of referred to myself as a kid, And so, which my mom finds kind of humorous. I call her and say, hey, it's your kid,
Are you calling her a goat?
But I think that I finally understand that I'm the messenger. I'm kind of the conduit of information and connecting, and I felt like we needed more ways to pull that together. So that's kind of where I came up with those hashtags. And
okay, so give me the words that AKOPTCH or PTH stands for.
Adult kids of parents that hoard.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. I do believe that's all I really wanted to cover with you today. Do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom for anybody who might be dealing with this or considering reaching out to you or someone like you to help deal with parents that are hoarding, aging parents that are hoarding?
Well, I want to thank you for having this discussion. I kind of have this idea about elephants in the room. And for me, this is one of those topics where it is often in the room and we are dancing all around it. The first thing I would say is be kind to yourself, especially if you are a kid or an adult that had to deal with that as a kid. You went through things that you shouldn't have to go through as a kid, most likely. So be kind to yourself, but also recognize that even though there is some narcissistic control issues often for that person, that there's still a human underneath that, and that you are talking to people, and no matter where they are, you're still making that personal connection. And something you had mentioned, like leaving the stuff until your stepdad passed away. it was kind of a decision I made to not focus as much on the stuff, but to focus on the relationship. So often you can find ways to focus on that relationship without having to constantly pound on the stuff issue, even though at some point you probably will be forced to make decisions that are going to make them angry. But if you can look at it from a perspective of they're a person and so are you, and if you can kind of make that connection still, then you have a better chance at least having some sort of relationship.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tammi, for being here today with me and talking about this. We know that with all of the anxiety that's going on with coronavirus and the things that are changing things and the isolation that people are in, there's an awful lot of guidance and hope that you can offer people right now. So I definitely encourage all of you that are watching this and listening, please reach out to Tammi if this is a situation that touches your life, and see what can be done to help you manage your anxiety or their control issues during this time. And I think that you'll make a big difference in the world, Tammi. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed talking with you, Gail.
Thank you. Alrighty, back to it. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, Facebook. When you open yourself up to action, work makes that recovery progress so much faster. That recovery is possible. You do not have to live as a victim until your last days. You have unbelievable strength, and I know that because you're still here. Do you want to create something completely unrecognizable with your life?